I am just thrilled to have Timothy Alberino on tonight. Um, I'm a very busy person, and there's certain people I like to listen to, and Timothy's one of them because he is absolutely one of the cutting edge researchers in all the cutting edge topics that we like to talk. Timothy, welcome. We're thrilled to have you back on again.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for having me on. It's a pleasure.
And our subject tonight is ancient technologies. And when we talk about ancient technologies, it always dovetails in with modern technologies. And I would just like to ask you a little bit about something I know you know a lot about is the DUMBs, these huge underground facilities that we have all over our nation that very few people know about, and how this ties in with the past and ancient technology.
Well, let's start off by saying that DUMBs, the modern adaptation of DUMBs, deep underground military bases, involves a very advanced technology. We have nuclear-powered drilling machines that are called subterranes that are able to drill many miles a day. We can, at this point in time, build facilities up to 10 miles, possibly even more, beneath the surface of the earth, and also under the waves of the ocean. So we have progressed dramatically in terms of our capability for building deep underground military bases. We acquired the technology from the Nazis. The Nazis are the ones that really began to develop the idea of building these deep underground installations in terms of their modern adaptations. And it was Zaverdorsch, under Zaverdorsch and the Todt organization, that Hitler commissioned to do all kinds of building programs for the Nazis. They were involved in building the Autobahn, and they built all kinds of military installations and also industrial installations for the Nazis. And near the end of the war, the Allies were absolutely devastating the fatherland with bombing campaigns, very aggressive bombing campaigns that were very effective, very deadly actually to the civilian populace. And Hitler answered these bombing campaigns. He couldn't, the Luftwaffe could not contend with Allied air power, so Hitler had to take his industrial strength, his industrial capability underground. So he commissioned the Todt organization in Zaverdorsch to begin to build these deep underground facilities, to develop the most important of the Nazi technologies, including the V1 and V2 rockets, the Vril rocket program, which was actually developed to a degree and was being deployed. Vril rockets were being shot over the ocean and devastating parts of Great Britain at the time, but there were larger, more important Wunderweapons under development by the Nazis than the Vril rockets. They were developing flying saucers. They were developing all kinds of very advanced technologies that Hitler protected under the ground in these facilities. And they basically, the death camps that were above ground went underground. They were work camps where many hundreds, if not thousands, of workers died building these engines of war in the underground bases. So that's where the modern adaptation of the DUMBs began. When the Allies invaded the fatherland, when we entered into Germany, we began to discover, little by little, we began to discover, and by the way, we're still discovering to this day, the Nazi underground bases that they were building, where they were housing, again, some of their most important projects. And so the Allies realized really quickly that if they had not launched that bombing campaign and brought the war to an end, then obviously Hitler would have been able to develop some of these weapons that he was working on, including famously the atomic bomb. He was very close to developing the atomic bomb, flying saucers of all kinds. and a lot of this technology was moved over to the Antarctic, and ended up under the ice.
Wow.
Steve Quayle wrote a book recently called Empire Beneath the Ice. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I've read that book. It is fantastic. Yeah, we
yes,
know
about
a couple shows
that.
of our work here. Yeah, that is
we,
amazing.
Sorry, I keep cutting you off, and I apologize. I was going to tell Timothy, I don't know what it is, but I see you now on the camera, but as soon as you start talking, your camera goes dead, and I'm not sure if there's a reason. We can hear you fine, so that's okay, but I'm not sure exactly what's going on with that. But sorry, David, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to let him know that in case there's something you could do to fix it.
Brother, you're fine. And as I remember, and I've seen documentaries on the History Channel and on Netflix about these underground Nazi facilities. Huge, mind-boggling how huge these things were. And in the hierarchy, I can't remember the general's name. You might know it, but he was in charge of building all of the underground Nazi bases. And Werner von Braun answered to this man, and this man answered to Hitler, and that general was one of the ones they never found. And it's just highly probable that the guy that was over all of these underground facilities, the construction of them, and they just used the Jewish workers as human sacrifices, that he very well ended up in Antarctica. And it's amazing to me how quickly they built these things, even after they were losing so much to the Allied aircraft. They build them so quick. Do you think it's even feasible that they had a little help from the other side in doing some of the amazing things that they did?
Well, that question opens a can of worms. First of all, the Allies, we launched, specifically the United States launched Project Paperclip. As soon as we discovered what the Germans had, we realized that the Germans were developing advanced weapons of war, that they had technology that we didn't even know existed. We were very fortunate to end the war when we did, because if it would have lingered on another couple of years, the Nazis would have won. Hands down, the Nazis would have won World War II. So obviously the superior air power of the Allies, I think, is what really tipped the scales in our favor. But that air superiority would not have lasted very long if the Nazis would have been able to deploy some of their flying saucer technology that they were almost that they had almost brought to a point of deployment, but we invaded too soon for them to be able to complete those projects. So Project Paperclip. So we brought all of these scientists over to the United States, many of them, the top scientists, including Zaverdorsch, Franz Zaverdorsch is his full name, with a lot of the members of the Todt organization. And among the scientists who came over to who we brought over to the United States was famously Werner von Braun, who became in charge of our NASA rocket program. In fact, in many ways, NASA was a Nazi organization. If you look at it from the standpoint of the scientists that were the head scientists at NASA, the guys that were really in charge of developing stuff, it was Project Paperclip Nazis. And we're not just talking about Nazis, we're talking about occultists, some of whom claim to be in contact with entities, with non-human entities that help them develop the technologies that they were using. And that goes back to the whole question of underground bases and the underground world and the Nazis' involvement in building underground bases leads us to the book The Coming Race. That was, if we go back far enough, we encounter a lot of occultism happening before World War II, definitely before World War I, actually, right around the World War I time at the turn of the century, leading up to World War I. Not only the United States, but the developed world, the civilized world, was absolutely steeped in occult activity. This is something that I think a lot of people have forgotten, I think, because it's not really covered when we take a look at popular culture, when we take a look at history, and certainly social studies, as they call it now in high school. They don't tell us about the amount of occult activity that was happening at the turn of the century. in the at the turn of the 20th century. There was all kinds of seances and occult practices that were underway, even among the middle class of the United States. Seances were very popular. Spiritualism was in vogue during that time, leading up to the First World War and certainly to the Second World War. So there were a myriad of occult societies, especially in Germany. And of course, the Germans, a lot of the German occultists like to trace themselves back to the Teutonic Knight Order, just like a lot of European societies like to trace themselves back to the Knights Templar or even the Knights of St. John and so forth, back to the Crusades. And so there was a very potent form of occult nationalism in Germany, in which very high-ranking members of society, and later to become high-ranking members and leading members of the Nazi Party, were involved in sex magic, were involved in Crowleyan-type sex magic. Of course, Aleister Crowley was a contemporary of Adolf Hitler, and during that particular time in history, the activity of the spiritualists was off the chart. So you had mediums, you had these sorcerers, for lack of a better term, that were conjuring demons, that were automatic writing messages that were coming from elsewhere, that were coming from the ether, that were coming from other planets. And these women were very intimately involved in the Third Reich, in the birth of the Third Reich, I should say, in the Vril Society, in the Thule Society, or the Thule Society. And they were, the legend goes that they channeled entities on a particular occasion and received schematics from these particular entities that were schematics for the construction of flying saucers, among other things. In fact, the schematics were given to them, to these mediums. The Vril maidens received these schematics in the ancient Sumerian language and in the Templars' secret coded language, in their cipher. So this is all part of the Nazi lore. This is where the Nazi Party really has its beginnings, was in occultism. And so there was an author by the name of, I want to say his name was Edward Bulwer Lytton, I believe was his name, who wrote a book called The Coming Race. And The Coming Race was about an individual who, through certain happenings, ended up under the ground, deep under the ground, and encountered this race that called themselves the Vril Ya. And the Vril Ya were a human-like race, but they were far more intelligent than human beings. They could communicate telepathically. By the way, the Vril Ya claimed to be escapees from the world before the Great Flood. They were able to survive by going under the ground, which I find very provocative. Yeah. But these entities, this individual who went down this shaft and found himself in this underground realm, was shown their technology, was taught their society and the way they live, and this was a very popular book among occultists. In fact, Helena Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky, who was one of the most influential occultists of the 19th century, believed, among other occultists, that the story that is related in The Coming Race was true, was a true account, or at least was laced with details that were accurate, that were based in reality. In other words, she believed, among the leading occultists, probably very likely Aleister Crowley as well, that there is an advanced ancient civilization living under the ground in the caverns of the earth. I find this very interesting because everywhere you go around the world, at least everywhere I've gone around the world, looking at the megaliths and investigating the pre-flood world, the antediluvian world, I find a number of common threads everywhere. And some of those common threads are, for one thing, the Vatican. The Vatican is always present. There is always a Vatican presence where you find very anomalous ancient things such as the megaliths. But then also the presence of vast underground caverns and all kinds of lore, all kinds of mythology related to those caverns and entities that exist in those caverns. And in fact, in our second film in The Unholy Sea, we talked to Anselm P. Rambla, a Spanish explorer and investigator, who proved, using scientific methods, that the Shinkana, what they call the portion of the underground network, the underground realm underneath the Andes, existed. He proved it scientifically, that the legends are true. There is, in fact, an ancient underground world beneath our feet. And in the case of the Shinkana in the Andes Mountains, some of these tunnels are lined with megalithic stones. And that in and of itself implies all kinds of things. It implies civilization that was capable of building, not only building under the ground, but building with megalithic stones under the ground. So when you talk about underground bases, both the modern adaptations and the ancient adaptations, it's an extremely fascinating subject. And here's the question. I'll kick it back to you guys. Here's the question that I have in my mind. Have we, in building these modern underground bases, have we stumbled into, if you will, have we made contact again with the entities that inhabit those realms?
Well, I believe there's an intent to actually do that. I believe that that's a part of the motive. And in the book that you referenced, of Mr. Quayle, The Empire Beneath the Ice, he had a fascinating theory that we did not win World War II. That the final battle of World War II was fought in 1947 when Admiral Byrd went to Antarctica. And you talk about leaving something out. The importance of Antarctica in World War II just totally gone and missing. But his theory was that we lost the final battle of World War II and that there was a treaty made for us to stay away from the Nazis, that there was a sharing of technology. And I think that the Nazis knew, definitely believed in this underground world, and that we believed, and I believe that it's very possible that places like Mount Weather and Groom Lake that are huge. I mean, these things are not just underground bases, they're cities with hospitals, 20,000 people and up work at some of these facilities. And I think that there's a definite intent to make contact with these this Nephilim civilization. And there was a fellow that you talked about in one of your analyses, which was just absolutely excellent, by the name of Phil Schneider, that was a whistleblower. And he actually related an incident where there was such a contact. I believe it was in New Mexico, maybe in the Dulce area, where he actually claims that he shot one of these creatures with a 9mm.
Mm-hmm. Shot it in the head and killed it. She shot several of them, actually, before he was shot by one of these entities, which he describes how it waved its hand over its chest and a blue beam emanated from this. He describes it as a tall gray alien, and a blue beam emanated from this creature and struck Phil Schneider. And with such impact, it was an electrical charge of some kind that it completely toasted, literally toasted one of his foot, melted the shoes on his feet, and he was missing a couple of fingers because it burnt his fingers. The electrical charge ran through his body, out his extremities, and caused a lot of damage. In fact, gave him cancer. He didn't die of cancer. He was killed. He died choked by a catheter with his hands tied behind his back after being tortured and beat. That was, by the way, the 13th attempt on his life, or the 14th, I can't remember, in 1 year. 1 year. And he was a whistleblower of, he worked on the underground bases. He had a security clearance, and he was a geologist, and he was an expert in explosives. And so he was one of the guys that would determine what kind of explosives needed to be used to blow out the chambers for the underground bases, depending on the kind of rock, the kind of mineral that they were encountering. And that incident that you referenced happened at Groom Lake.
Groom Lake.
Or actually, I'm sorry, it happened at It happened at the Dulce base by the Los Alamos laboratory. And they were blowing out some extra chambers to expand the base, the underground base, and they blew open a shaft that apparently was inhabited by these very tall, grotesque, disgusting entities, as Phil describes them on several occasions. And Phil says that after that incident with these beings that shot him, that the famous Dulce War ensued, in which many Green Berets and different special operators died fighting these non-human creatures that began to emerge and overrun, I guess, the Dulce base. So, and a lot of people will roll their eyes at this kind of information, but I'll tell you what's really frightening about this information, number one, it's never been debunked. Number two, when you dig into this information, you find all kind of corroborating information that suggests that this story is absolutely true. And then you have, of course, if you want to see it, I mean, if you really doubt that Phil Schneider was telling the truth, just pull up Phil Schneider murdered on Google Images, and I think that will help your doubt, because there's a picture of him with a blue face, choked out by a catheter. Remember, the man was missing a couple fingers on his hand. There's no way he could have tied that catheter behind his own neck. And so obviously somebody killed him. They wanted him dead after a year on a lecture circuit, multiple attempts on his life. This is very serious stuff that we're talking about when dealing with underground bases and the kind of activity. By the way, at this point, there are rumored to be, and I believe it to be true, there are what they call joint human alien bases, where we are actually interacting with some of these entities, and they are sharing technology with us under certain agreements.
I'll tell you an interesting. Yeah, I got a picture pulled up here. This is one at the Yucca Mountains. Interesting story I heard from William Schnoblem, actually, and he's one of our friends. We've had him on several times. Underneath a Mormon temple, he claimed that there was one of these domes that were inhabited by reptilians, that they were working together with human. And I, you know, obviously that's a wild story to think about, but when you see all the different evidences that yourself and Steve Quell and people like that, people like the guy you're just talking about, have come forward. And then he was talking about this years ago. I mean, this was like, I remember hearing something about this like 7-8 years ago from William. It's interesting stuff. And you see these massive multi-million-dollar tunnels out in the middle of nowhere like this. There's definitely something going on. It's so interesting to me. We were asking about different technologies. Do we think that they found certain technologies or made contact with these entities? I think that I really do. And if you look at the antediluvian world, right, when Nimrod kind of picked up, that was one of the main goals. They were looking for these vaults of Enoch. They were looking for these vaults of information. I believe it's 7 vaults. Correct me if I'm wrong. I can't remember. But we have a show coming on not we have a show. There's a show called The Curse of Oak Island, and they're on this massive search for this Templar place, these underground tunnels that they found in this Oak Island, and looking for information. And we have all these different scrolls that have been found, and I think that they're gathering all these things. Also, Hitler was gathering these relics, gathering these tablets, gathering everything that he could gather together for a reason. And I think that the Bible talks about the Antichrist being able to understand dark sentences. I think that they're bringing all this together for a specific purpose, and I think that every time they find something, I don't know if they hid it over the years and they're just now finding some of this, or once some of the organizations went underground because of persecution, they hid a lot of these things and they're looking for them. I don't know exactly what to make of it, but it's so interesting. I just want to make that comment, and sorry about that, David. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
You're fine, John. No, you're fine. That is absolutely spot on. And the photo that Timothy mentioned of Mr. Schneider, it's horrific. I mean, if you just look at that photo, this man was horrifically tortured. I mean, horrifically tortured. Just to look at that body It's disturbing to look at it, and you do not choke yourself to death with a catheter with your hands tied behind your back. I mean, no one in their sane mind is going to believe that. And
missing a couple of fingers.
yeah, and Bill Cooper is another one. Bill Cooper years ago was talking about this stuff, and he wound up dead. And I think the Mormons, they're just taking a clue from the Catholics, because as you have so well brought out in The Unholy See and the other documentary, that from the beginning, Catholicism all over the world has been building their churches over top of these underground ancient facilities. And I think they did it with a definite knowledge that they were wanting. And now this is just what the Vatican, a lot of what Tom Horn has brought out, that they're talking openly about making contact with the ETs. And I think that they very well know that the ETs are underneath us instead of out there. And it's just amazing. And one of the things that just really troubles me is an amazing statistic. There are 800,000 children reported missing every year under the age of 18 in the United States. And of all the people missing in the United States in a year, 500,000 a year don't turn up. 500,000 people every year in the United States vanish. And I have to believe that a lot of these people are turning up for some very bad reasons in these underground facilities, because they're just huge. Right here in America, there are 5 and 10-story buildings in some of these places. They're cities. It's just amazing.
That's right. And think about this. I believe at this point we have the technology to clone a human being to adulthood. And if that's the case, which again, I believe it is, we could be looking at generations of human beings that have lived and died in abject slavery beneath our feet, who were bred to be slaves of the elite. And that's just one of the contingencies. I mean, you talk about these children disappearing. Obviously, we know, and it's coming to slowly beginning to leak into the public sphere. The pedophilia ring that exists and that penetrates into every echelon of society, especially the upper echelons of society, dealing with the politics, dealing with the clergymen at the Vatican, dealing with even the leaders of the different denominations, certainly the leaders of the Mormon Church, some of the, probably very likely, some of the evangelical preachers on television are involved in these pedophile rings. I mean, there are, these children are being taken, and the most disgusting, nightmarish things are happening to them. And I have 4 boys. I have 4 young boys. And there's nothing that disgusts me more, nothing that horrifies me more than the thought of little boys and girls being taken, abducted by these psychopathic, demonized individuals to be both used as sex slaves and in some cases maybe even fed as food to certain kinds of things beneath the ground. It is absolutely appalling. I can only imagine, I imagine in my mind the bowls of wrath filling.
Oh, boy.
In heaven over this kind of stuff. And remember in the book of Revelations that they flee into the mountains and beg the mountains to fall and hide them from the wrath of God, because they are shoring it up. They are storing up for themselves wrath unimaginable for what they're doing on the earth at this point in time. I think that the wickedness that is happening on this planet at this very moment is beyond what any of us can imagine. It's beyond the darkest movie, the most horrific movie that we've ever seen. And it is becoming, what's happening is it's becoming just like it was on the earth in the days before those bowls of wrath that were stored up in the pre-flood world were poured out on the earth, and all life was destroyed except for Noah and his family and the animals that were present on the ark. That's what's happening right now. I don't know. I couldn't tell you if we're in the end times, or I don't know. But I can tell you one thing: those bowls are filling.
Amen.
And
Closer, there's no doubt about it. We're doing a show about Pizzagate on Monday with a few other people. You're welcome to join us if you want for a roundtable. But you're right, this pedophilia ring that's busting out, this stuff's been going on for a long time, but it's just now being exposed. It's disgusting, man. And I have 2 young boys myself. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and just the thought of this kind of stuff is just so horrifying. And I grew up in South Texas, and people were kidnapped all the time, of course, by Mexican mafia and stuff like that. But this was happening to people, and they were talking about the connection between that and the Haitian trafficking going on. What have you heard anything about that?
I know that the sex trafficking ring that exists on this planet at this point in time is probably a much larger organization than the drug trafficking ring. And that's a scary thought. And so the children are, I mean, I have heard, and I don't know if it's true, I can imagine that it's true, that a lot of these pedophiles use Facebook, and they use the different social networking platforms to choose the children they want. It's a very scary thought, but it's real. I mean, it came to light, the kind of activity that John Podesta is involved in. And anybody who looks at those WikiLeaks emails will quickly discover that there's a lot of coded pedophilia language embedded in there. And of these people, they speak to each other in coded languages. There's a whole, I mean, there's coded language for pedophilia, and one of the most famous ones is chicken hawker, which a lot of politicians kick around, because a lot of them are what you call chicken hawkers, and of course, chicken hawks go after chicks. So there's a lot of that kind of, and when I say chicks, I mean little chicks, baby chickens, and there's a lot of that kind of terminology kicked around in those emails. And all the pizza terminology. It is, again, it is appalling beyond comprehension. And really it confirms what a lot of us have been saying for a long time, that the politicians, that the lawyers, that the bureaucrats at the highest levels of international government, many of them are at the very least Crowleyan adepts. They're Thelemites. They are involved in the grossest of sexual magic practices, and even some of them human sacrifice, the drinking of blood, the eating of flesh, every abominable thing these people are involved in. And like I said, coming upon the turn of the 20th century, there is a rise of spiritualism, not only in the United States, but in the Western world, like I don't think we've ever seen before. But I think it's crescendoing even now, that it's not so public anymore. It's gone from you know, the neighbor down the road doing seances in their kitchen, to the bureaucrats, to the public figures behind closed doors drinking blood, performing sex magic orgies, pedophilia. I mean, I think that these guys are doing things that maybe even might have made Crowley blush in his day.
Yeah, I have heard these stories for years. Right here in Evansville, we have dealt with satanic ritual abuse, and these stories are just hard to even think about without getting deeply angry. And here in Evansville, there was the Blue House case, which John is doing a documentary on, which involved, there were 20 children that made the allegation that they were being taken out of public schools and taken to a Blue House, where they were doing all of these things: cannibalism, human sacrifice, sexual perversion. And according to the children, there were police officers, school teachers involved in this, and it's just a horrific thing. But I have to believe that many of these children are turning up in these underground facilities for all of these reasons. It's just absolutely hard to think about. And when I think about well, like Mr. Schneider, he is a rare case of a person being a whistleblower. And when you've got people like at Area 51, you've got thousands of people working there. To keep that level of secrecy, it's got to operate like a secret society. The whole underground America has got to be the largest secret society on earth.
I agree. I think these people, they're bound, by the way, in these secret societies. They take oaths that involve inviting demonic spirits into their bodies. They take oaths that involve giving these entities leave, permission to destroy them, to kill them, to torment them if they should break their word and expose the society. That really is the only way. I think you're absolutely right, David, that you can keep the lid on this kind of thing. There have to be some very frightening consequences for people who, beyond death, by the way, for people who come out and blow the lid on this thing. That's why I think that Donald Trump is in such a precarious situation right now, because he's not just dealing with crooked Hillary. He is dealing with a cult, a society, a darkness that I don't even think that he can even begin to realize the depth of the darkness that he's dealing with when he talks about draining the swamp. I mean, when you talk about draining the swamp of Washington, for example, it goes far beyond getting rid of political hacks. The roots of occultism in Washington, D.C. are so deep and are protected at all costs. I mean, just think about how vehemently they protect, how diligently they protect the sex ring that goes around in Washington involving adults, consenting adults. I forget the madam that came out. I forget her name, but she ended up dead. Remember, she killed herself allegedly when she was going to come out and start to name names of the people who were involved in that sex ring at Washington, D.C. That's not even pedophilia. That wasn't even the depths of it. That was the very surface level situation, and they killed her before she could drop any names of any significance. So you're absolutely right. We're not dealing with politicians anymore. We're dealing with the darkest, most demonic activities that humankind has ever been involved in.
Yeah, and John DeCamp wrote a book called The Nebraska Cover-Up. He did a great job years ago bringing out the connection between the pedophile rings and the politicians, and I believe that's why Manuel Noriega wound up in a American prison, because he was known to throw the parties for the American politicians down there in Panama, where they would be able to have their children. And this is just, you just, there's not words for it. But what do you think in the American political machine? Who's in the know and who isn't? At what level in politics do you have to get at to be in the know with what's really going on with all of these things?
Well, I was enlightened in terms of how the hierarchy works in the Illuminist hierarchies, which there are many, and they're not all on the same team. They're dueling. They're always vying for power, one group above the other. There are many Masonic groups. There are many Luminist groups that come from very ancient family bloodlines. Those are the most powerful ones, and it trickles down all the way into mafia families, your run-of-the-mill Italian mob. The hierarchy is very complex, but there is a distinction within that hierarchy, and the distinction is the Crowleyan adepts versus your good old-fashioned Masons and so forth. And it's the Crowleyan adepts that are the really abominable bad ones. that even high-level Masons and high-level Illuminists are afraid of and are disgusted by. And of course, I believe that as a believer, that believers should not be involved in secret societies. And I don't advocate involvement in secret societies. However, I can tell you that not all the adepts of secret societies are involved in sex magic and are involved in the darker pedophilia and that sort of thing. A lot of them are fraternities that are interested in power and influence. They're all based on astrology. They're all based on ancient wisdom, the mystery cults, the knowledge of the Watchers, the illicit knowledge of the Watchers. In fact, I learned that most of the, in fact, all of the Illuminists trace their bloodlines back to Nimrod and beyond. They trace their bloodlines through Nimrod back into the pre-flood world to the Watchers themselves. This was something that I found to be very interesting. And so when you talk about the power players in Washington or at the UN or wherever, you have dueling factions. You have your ancient bloodline occult families that are still demonic. There's no question. I mean, they're still involved in demonic activity. These are still wicked people. But they're not the Crowleyan breed. The Crowleyan breed, which I believe that is exactly what Hillary Clinton comes from. She is a Thelemite through and through. The Crowleyan breed, and that of course became evident with John Podesta in the ceremony that he was going to take part in. That was a Crowleyan ceremony. So the Crowleyan faction within the Illuminists, within the Masons, that's where the really, really bad ones are. And there has been an infiltration, and there is that faction is growing rapidly. And it's what a lot of the, we'll call them traditional Illuminists, are trying to fight against, is the Crowleyan infiltration, because the Crowleyan infiltration is just all about sex magic and intercourse with demons and drinking blood and sacrificing human beings. I mean, it is the darkest, nastiest stuff you can possibly imagine. So, having said that, I believe that many people who reach the higher echelons of society, whether it be in politics, whether it be even lawyers, even powerful lawyers and doctors, and up in those high levels of society, more often than not, these people are going to be part of some kind of a Masonic lodge or something. But within those factions, there are the darker Thelemite, Crowleyan factions. They're the ones that are real deadly, dangerous, pedophilic. They're the ones that are pulling the strings right now, I think, in Washington, D.C., certainly at the Vatican. Certainly at the Vatican. The Vatican has, again, just like I just mentioned with the dichotomy that exists between sort of the traditional Illuminist families versus the Crowleyan infiltrated stuff. At the Vatican, you have the traditional Catholics, you have the traditional Roman Catholic priests and bishops, who I believe are part of a satanic system, you know, being as they are traditional Roman Catholic bishops and priests. But at the same time, apart from them, you have a Crowleyan faction. In fact, it's much more ancient than the Crowleyans, than Aleister Crowley. It goes back to the pagan, the sex magic from the pagan Roman cults and even beyond to the Babylonians. But these factions, they are vying for power within the Vatican. In fact, the stepping down, the renunciation by by Benedict XVI was a coup, was a Jesuit coup within the Vatican, and it was because it was there was a very powerful organization within the Vatican. There is a very powerful organization within the Vatican that is led by a man who is called the Pink Pope. The Pink Pope is the head of the gay lobby within the Vatican, but of course also with that comes the pedophilia, with that comes all kinds of ridiculous pedophilia happening at the Vatican, and I was told about all kinds of just very disheartening, ridiculous things that go on in Rome. I think Rome is like ground zero for all of this, by the way. But so the reason why I bring that up is because I want people to understand that this is not just a simple one-dimensional issue. This is a multi-dimensional, complex issue that deals with all kinds of societies, secret societies and hierarchies within these societies. And you have the Crowleyan faction, and then you have the traditional bloodline factions. You have there's vying within the whole organization of the occult mystery schools. They're killing each other. I mean, they're taking each other out in some cases. And it's important to keep that understanding, I think, in the forefront, that it's a very complex thing, because it's too easy to write the whole thing off if you don't grasp the complexity of it. It's too easy to just paint with a broad brush and say, well, I don't believe that everybody in Washington, D.C. is drinking blood. Well, that's too one-dimensional. They're not. Everybody is not doing that. You have to understand the way that these cult societies work, the different hierarchies, the different levels, the Crowleyan infiltration. And then when you begin to see the complexity of the thing, it actually becomes a lot more frightening than you originally thought. Because the more complex something is, the more difficult it is to root out, the more difficult it is to bring to light and to combat.
Yeah, there has been a huge war within Freemasonry since the 18th century. And the war has been between the Grand Orient Freemasonry, or Continental Freemasonry, and the Grand Lodge Freemasonry that came out of England. And the basic difference between the Grand Lodge Freemasonry and Grand Orient Freemasonry, you had to believe in some kind of a god to join British Freemasonry, if you will. But you could be an atheist and join Grand Orient Freemasonry. It is the lodge of Voltaire. It is the lodge of the absolute Christian God haters. And since the War of 1812, it's a long story. I won't go into all of it. But basically, from that time, the Democratic Party has reflected the philosophy of the Grand Orient Freemasonry, and the Republican Party has reflected the philosophy of Grand Lodge British Freemasonry. Both are going to the same direction. The end game is the same, but they want to fight over who's going to run the thing. Then you throw in the Vatican, then you throw in the Mormons, and all of these people want the same thing, but they all want to run the show, and they will get very vicious with one another. And this is very, very needful to have a correct analysis of what's going on.
I agree. And there's also the battle, the ongoing battle between the regular Freemasons, Freemasonry, and the irregular Freemasonry, the accepted rites, whether it be the Scottish Rite, the accepted Scottish, or the accepted York. And then there are the irregular Masons, the Masons who are rejected by the accepted rites. I have an acquaintance who's a Mason, and always talks to me about Freemasonry, and I have long, in-depth conversations with him. And he swears up and down that they absolutely reject these irregular Masonic orders that worship Lucifer, and he refers to them as the Albert Pike type Masonic orders and so forth. But really, the secret society is about subversion. It's about control. It's about acquiring knowledge and power, and doing it through fraternity of individuals. There are very, very weak, irrelevant Masonic lodges, very irrelevant, weak Masonic lodges that are not pulling any strings of power, believe me. I mean, they have a hard time organizing events in small towns. But then, depending on which lodge you're dealing with, there are extremely powerful lodges that are pulling the strings of international policy and influencing kings. So again, it's healthy to to see things from a multidimensional perspective, to have an understanding of the perplexity and the complexity that we're dealing with when we talk about secret societies, and certainly the complexity that we're dealing with when we talk about angels and demons and the princes and powers of darkness. I mean, it does not help, especially in this day and age, to be locked into one-dimensional mindset when it comes to these things. So thank you, David, for bringing clarification to that issue with the Masons. I hadn't known that.